Nadine Eloise Chambers had been organizing food drives for 17 years. She kept a file for each year's drive, the timeline, the site coordinator list, the donor records, the final count, and one page at the back that she called the lessons page, which recorded anything that had required a structural change during that year's campaign. Most years had one entry on the lessons page, sometimes none. In October of this year, the lessons page had two entries, the entry-level receipt comparison and the structural separation of the binder and receipt book. She had written them down on the Sunday morning after the committee meeting in the file for this year's drive so that next year's coordinator, if she was ever not the coordinator, which had not happened yet but would happen eventually, would have the full picture without reconstruction. The file would be there. The record would be there. The two entries on the lessons page would be clear. That was how knowledge moved forward. You wrote it down in the right place in plain language that a person who had not been in the parking lot on that Thursday afternoon could understand and act on without calling you for context. You wrote it for the next person. You had always been writing it for the next person. 17 years of it. She was 61 years old, and she had started in the aftermath of a plant closure in the east part of the county that had left 400 families without income in the middle of November, when the food bank's regular supply chain had not been designed for that kind of sudden need. The plant had made industrial components and had employed 800 people and had closed in October with 60 days' notice, and the 60 days had not been enough for the workers or the community or the food bank. The food bank had a supply chain calibrated for its regular volume, and the plant closure had doubled the need in 2 weeks, and the supply chain had not scaled that fast. Nadine had heard about the closure from the woman who cut her hair who had a brother at the plant, and she had thought about it for 2 days and then begun making calls. She called St. Andrew's first. She was already the parish administrator, and the parish had resources and connections and the leadership to act when the case was clear. Then she called other churches. Then she called the grocery stores. Then she called the Restaurant Association and the school district's food services director and 3 large county employers whose human resources directors she knew well enough to ask a direct question and expect a direct answer. She had called individual families she knew not with a general appeal, but with a specific request. I need 10 items of this type by this date, at this address, because she had found over her adult life that specific requests were more likely to produce results than general appeals, and she was not interested in appeals, she was interested in results. She organized the collection and the distribution in 11 days, starting with the names in her personal phone and ending with 3,000 pounds of food and household supplies distributed to 412 families over a long December weekend. The food bank director at the time, a woman named Helen Garrett, who had been running the food bank for 4 years, had called her on the Monday after the distribution and said, "How did you do that in 11 days?" Nadine had said, "I called everybody I knew, and I asked them directly for a specific thing, and they said yes." Helen had said, "Can you do it again next year?" Nadine had said, "I can do it better next year if I start in October instead of November." Helen had said, "Will you start in October?" Nadine had said, "I will do it every year until it is not necessary." They had both understood that this was a commitment that would last a long time. She was 61 years old, and it had not yet become unnecessary. She worked as a parish administrator at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, a position she had held for 14 years. The work required organization and the management of multiple concurrent processes. The liturgical calendar, the facilities schedule, the staff, the volunteers, the communications, the finances, and it required knowing which of those processes were running correctly and which required intervention and what intervention looked like when the resource was people rather than materials. She had a specific understanding of the difference between a process that was underperforming because of resource constraints and one that was underperforming because of a structural problem, and the difference mattered because the responses were different. Resource constraints required more resources, more volunteers, more funding, more donor outreach, more site capacity. Structural problems required different structures, a changed procedure, a new step in the process, a redesigned form, a revised accountability mechanism. The common error in the management of complex operations was to apply the resource constraint response to a structural problem, which produced more of a thing that was not working correctly, rather than fixing the thing that was not working. She had made that error twice in her first 3 years at St. Andrews and had corrected it both times, and had not made it since. She had been doing it for 14 years, and she was very good at knowing which was which, and when the question was ambiguous, she knew how to run the investigation that would tell her. She had developed over 14 years at St. Andrews and over 17 years of food drive work, a particular skill at reading records, the kind of reading that does not take the number at face value, but asks whether the number is consistent with other numbers. It should be consistent with. The liturgical calendar should be consistent with the facility's schedule. The volunteer hours logged should be consistent with the work completed. The intake binders should be consistent with the receipt books. When they were not consistent, the inconsistency was the information, and the information was the thing you acted on. She had been reading records this way for a long time, and it had become the natural default of her attention. Everything had a corresponding record somewhere, and when you could compare them, you should. She had a husband named Robert, who was 63, and a retired high school principal who had run Millbrook High for 16 years before retiring 3 years ago. He still got calls from former students, calls from people in their 30s and 40s, and occasionally their 50s, who wanted to tell him something and who had kept his number for 20 years, against the possibility that they would want to tell him. He said he enjoyed the calls. Nadine believed him. He had the quality of a person whose professional life had been about paying attention to young people, and the attention did not fully switch off because the professional life ended. He tutored 3 students on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday mornings, and spent the rest of his time reading and gardening, and occasionally helping Nadine with logistics when the food drive scale required it, which it did in October, when the 15-site operation required more telephone calls than one person could make in a day. She had 2 adult children, a son named Darius, 36, an accountant in Atlanta who had the same orderly mind his mother had, but applied it to balance sheets rather than intake logs, and a daughter named Kezia, 33, who was finishing a doctorate in public health at Ohio State, and whose research focused on institutional data gaps in nonprofit service delivery, which she had explained to Nadine at a family dinner 2 years ago as the study of how the way organizations collect information shapes what they are able to know about what they are doing. And Nadine had said, "Yes, I know about that." Kezia had looked at her and said, "I thought you might." She had 4 grandchildren whose names she knew and whose drawings were on the refrigerator. She did not think about the grandchildren when she was doing the food drive work. She thought about the 400 families in November 20 years ago, whose faces she had remembered for a long time and that had been gradually replaced in her memory by the faces of other families who had needed what the drive could give them. And the 400 original families had become a principle rather than a specific memory. When people need food, the record has to be accurate because the count is what determines whether the food gets there. The Millbrook Community Food Drive ran in October and November each year, collecting non-perishable food and household supplies for the county's 3 food pantries and the community kitchen at First Methodist. Nadine had been coordinating it for 11 of the past 17 years, since the original coordinator, a woman named Dorothy Kramer, had moved to Charlotte when her husband took a job there, and Helen Garrett had called Nadine and said, "We need someone who can do what Dorothy did." Nadine had said, "I cannot do what Dorothy did. I will do what I do, and we will see what that produces." What it produced in the first year was an expanded donor base and a new site at the library branch in the northeast part of the county that had not had a collection site before and that turned out to be in a high donor traffic area. In the second year, she added the corporate partnership program and brought in 4 businesses as sustained donors rather than one-time contributors. By the third year, the drive was a recognizably different operation from the one Dorothy Kramer had coordinated, larger and more systematically managed and with clearer record-keeping at every site. She had taken the record-keeping seriously from the beginning because the record-keeping was the thing that told her whether the system was working. She had designed the intake process with 2 matching records, the binder for the site's log and the receipt book for the donor's copy specifically, so that there was always a cross-check available. She had not designed it with theft in mind. She had designed it because the count mattered and counts were subject to error, and a redundant record was the way to catch errors that mattered. In 11 years, the cross-check had caught 3 genuine counting errors at 3 different sites, all of them honest mistakes and all of them small, 5 items here, 3 items there. She had never had a situation where the discrepancy was not consistent with an honest counting error. She managed the donation sites through a site coordinator system. Each of the 15 sites had a designated coordinator who was responsible for staffing supply receipt inventory and weekly reports to Nadine. The reports came in every Monday morning by email, and she reviewed them at the kitchen table with coffee before 8 o'clock and flagged any site that needed attention. Low supply, volunteer gaps, logistics issues, count anomalies. She had built the system over 11 years, and it ran well. In a well-run year, she would flag 2 or 3 sites across the 6-week campaign for one issue or another, and the issues would be addressed, and the drive would close with the count matching the distribution and the food where it needed to be. In October of the current year, she had received a report from Site 7, which was the station at the Millbrook Community Center, that supplies had come in below the previous year's level for the 2nd week in a row. Site 7 was one of the drive's highest volume sites. It was on a well-traveled road in the center of town. It had good signage. Its site coordinator had been running it for 4 years and knew the operation, and its donor base included a significant portion of the town's regular food drive participants. A 31% decline at Site 7 was not a number that had an obvious innocent explanation. She had flagged it and called the site coordinator a longtime volunteer named Patricia Dumas, who had been running Site 7 for 4 years. Patricia was 67 years old and had been a registered nurse for 35 years before retiring, and she managed her volunteer site the way she had managed a hospital ward, methodically with attention to the numbers and clear documentation. She was not the kind of person who would miss a 31% decline without noticing it. She said, "I do not know what is happening. The donors are coming. I see the cars pulling in and people walking through the door and dropping things off. But the count is low and I cannot explain why." Nadine said, "Have you noticed anything different at the intake station?" Patricia said, "We have a new volunteer this week. Aaron Pruitt. Bradley assigned him last week. He seems fine, but I have not been standing next to him the whole time." Nadine said, "I will come in person on Thursday." She drove to the community center on a cool October Thursday and parked and went in through the side entrance where the intake station was set up, a folding table with the binder and the receipt book, and a basket of pens, and a sign that said, "Millbrook Food Drive, please drop off here." The station had been at this location for 11 years. Nadine knew the space. She sat with Patricia in the folding chairs behind the table, and they reviewed the intake log together. She looked at the counts for each day of the current week and the prior week, and compared them to the same days the prior year. The difference was significant, 31% below the prior year average, and the difference was not explained by any factor Patricia had identified. Donor traffic appeared normal. The site hours were the same. The signage was unchanged. The weather had been comparable. She said to Patricia, who has been staffing the intake station, "Patricia said we have 3 regular volunteers this week and last. Frank Bellamy and Tom Kessler have been with us for 4 years each. They work Wednesdays and Fridays. Aaron Pruitt is the new assignment. He has been here Monday and Tuesday for the past 2 weeks. He was assigned by Bradley Holt." I have watched him briefly on 2 occasions. He seems to know the process. He counts and logs and issues the receipts. I have not had any reason to intervene. Nadine said all right. Walk me through the intake process the way you trained him to do it. Patricia walked her through it. Donations came in through the community center's side entrance. The volunteer at the intake station stood at the table and received the donation. If it was in a bag or box, the volunteer unpacked it on the table and counted the items individually, calling out the count. The count went into the intake binder in the log column for that day, a running tally entry by entry with the time and the approximate description of what was received. Then the volunteer wrote out a receipt from the receipt book. The receipt had the current date, the item count for that specific donation, and a space for the donor's name if they provided it. The donor got the top copy of the receipt, and the carbon copy stayed in the book in order by date and time. At the end of the day, the binder total and the receipt book total should match, because each represented the same count of items received that day. It was a simple system, and it was redundant by design. The binder was the drive's internal record. The receipt book was the donor-facing record. They should be identical if the counting was correct and the logging was correct. In 11 years, the system had been correct with 3 minor errors that had each been caught and corrected within the same day when Patricia or another site coordinator had done an end-of-day reconciliation. The reconciliation was supposed to happen every day. Nadine asked, "Is the reconciliation happening every day?" Patricia said, "I check it myself every day I am here. On the days I am not here, I trust the site volunteers to do it. I have not been here every Monday and Tuesday this cycle." Nadine said, "Do the receipts match the binder for this week?" Patricia looked at her with the expression of a person who has just understood what question is being asked and what the question implies. She said, "I do not know. I have not compared them for those specific days. I compared the daily totals, the binder total at end of day, and the receipt book total at end of day, and the totals matched. But I have not looked at whether the individual entries match throughout the day." Nadine said, "Can we do that comparison now?" Patricia went to get the binder and the receipt book for the current week. The counts in the receipt book did not match the counts in the intake binder. Nadine went through the entries one by one, Patricia beside her. They started with Monday of the current week. The first entry in the receipt book was for 9:43 in the morning, a donation of 8 cans and 2 boxes of pasta, total 10 items. The corresponding entry in the binder at 9:43 was 7 items. The receipt said 10. The binder said 7. They went to the second entry. The receipt said 6 items. The binder said 4. They went through the entire day. Every entry where the count exceeded 5 items showed a lower number in the binder than in the receipt book. The small donations, 2 items, 3 items matched. The larger donations did not. Monday binder total 47, receipts total 53, discrepancy 6 items. Tuesday, the same pattern. Large donations recorded lower in the binder than in the receipts. Binder, total 32 receipts, total 41. Discrepancy 9 items. The count discrepancy extended to the prior week. Patricia brought the prior week's binder and receipt book. Wednesday through Friday of the prior week, Aaron Pruitt had staffed the intake station, and the binder showed significantly lower counts than the receipts for all 3 days. The pattern was the same. Small donations matched large donations did not. The discrepancies on large donations were always between 2 and 5 items. The effect was cumulative. The total discrepancy across the 5 Pruitt-staffed days was 61 items. Patricia set down the receipt book. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I did the end-of-day reconciliation wrong. I compared the binder total to the receipt book total, but the receipt book total was calculated from the carbon copies which show what he told the donor. If the carbon copy says 10 and the binder says 7, the discrepancy is in the individual entries, not the totals, because he was writing the correct number on the receipt, and the lower number in the binder, and the end-of-day total in the receipt book was calculated by the site coordinator from the carbons, and the end-of-day total in the binder was calculated from the binder entries, and if someone else was calculating those totals, they would not match. But he was doing both calculations himself on his days. He was the one adding up the columns. Nadine said yes. He could make the binder total and the receipt total appear to match at the day level if he controlled both calculations. Patricia said, but the individual entries do not match. Nadine said no. The individual entries tell a different story. That is why I asked to compare them. Nadine said, has Aaron Pruitt been the intake volunteer on all the days with discrepancies? Patricia looked at the volunteer schedule. She said yes, every day with a discrepancy. Nadine said, are there any discrepancies on days he did not staff the intake station? Patricia checked all the Frank Bellamy and Tom Kessler days against their receipts. She said no, none. Nadine said, I need to call Bradley Holt. She sat in the parking lot of the community center for a few minutes before calling Bradley Holt. She was organizing what she knew, the specific findings, the comparison data, the volunteer schedule, the exact days, in the order that would be most useful for the conversation. She had learned over many years of administrative work that the way you presented a finding was as important as the finding itself. Because a finding presented clearly could be acted on immediately, and a finding presented without structure required the other person to do the organizing work that you could have done for them, and the organizing work cost time that could be better spent on action. She called Bradley Holt from the parking lot. She said, I am at Site 7. I have been reviewing the intake records alongside the receipt book, comparing individual entries. I have found discrepancies in the item counts for every day that Aaron Pruitt has staffed the intake station at this site. The binder shows lower numbers than the receipts on every donation above 5 items on those days. The total discrepancy across 5 Pruitt-staffed days is 61 items. The discrepancies are not present on any days staffed by the other 2 volunteers at this site. I need to understand who Aaron Pruitt is, what his background check showed, and whether there have been any prior concerns about him at any site. Bradley Holt received this information in the specific tone it was given, which was direct and precise, and without accusation, but also without softening. He was the volunteer coordinator for the drive, and had been in the role for 3 years, having come from an event management background where he had coordinated large volunteer corps for festivals and fundraising events in a larger city before moving to Millbrook. He managed 60 volunteers at peak season, tracking availability and assignments and background check status and site requests, and he kept organized records of all of it. He was well-meaning and conscientious and had believed the volunteer application and background check process to be adequate, which it was for the kind of issues it had been designed to prevent. He had never had a situation like this one in 3 years on the drive. He said Aaron Pruitt applied in September. He applied online through the volunteer portal. His background check came back clean, no criminal history. He listed prior volunteer experience at 2 other organizations. I assigned him to Site 7 because Patricia Dumas had requested an additional intake volunteer for Mondays and Tuesdays, and his availability matched exactly. I am not aware of any prior concerns about him. Nadine said, I am also going to ask you to check whether there have been any concerns about intake counts at other sites where he has been assigned. If he has been assigned to multiple sites, I want to know whether the sites reported any count anomalies during weeks when he was staffing them. Bradley said, I can look into that. Nadine said, please look into it today. I need to know before the weekend. I am going to be documenting what I found at Site 7, and I want the full picture before I send it to Victor Osai and Helen Garrett. Bradley said I will call you back by 4. He called her back at 3:48. He said I found 2 prior reports. One is from Site 12 3 weeks ago. The site coordinator, a woman named Margaret Alves, noted in her weekly report that the count for the prior week was lower than she expected given the donor traffic she had observed. She attributed it to reduced donor enthusiasm. She noted that some donors had seemed to be giving smaller amounts than in prior years. She did not do a receipt comparison. I pulled the volunteer schedule for Site 12 for that week. Aaron Pruitt staffed intake on Monday and Tuesday of that week. Margaret Alves staffed intake herself on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Margaret's days do not show any anomaly in her report. He continued, "The second report is from Site 3 4 weeks ago. The site coordinator is James Whitfield. He noted the count was lower than the prior year for that week and attributed it to seasonal variation. He said October tends to come in low and it usually picks up in November. He did not express concern." I pulled his volunteer schedule. Aaron Pruitt staffed intake at Site 3 on Wednesday of that week. James Whitfield staffed it himself the other days. Nadine said, "So the pattern is consistent. A count anomaly at each site on the specific days Aaron Pruitt was staffing intake with no anomaly on the days other volunteers staffed. The coordinators attributed the anomalies to external factors because they had no comparison to make." Bradley said yes. That is what the records show. Nadine said, "I need the receipt books and the intake binders from Sites 3 and 12 for the Pruitt staffed days. Can you get them to me by tomorrow morning?" Bradley said, "I will call Margaret Alves and James Whitfield tonight. I will have the materials to you by 9. He was at her door at 8:45 with 3 binders and 2 receipt books in a box. She sat at the kitchen table with Robert, who looked at the materials and said, "I will make more coffee." She said yes. "Please." They spent 2 hours doing side-by-side comparisons for both sites. The comparisons at Sites 3 and 12 confirmed the pattern exactly. At Site 12, Pruitt staffed days showed a cumulative discrepancy of 43 items with the same signature small donations, matching between binder and receipt. Large donations showing 2 to 5 fewer items in the binder than in the receipt. At Site 3, the single Pruitt staffed day showed a discrepancy of 18 items. The pattern was identical across all 3 sites. The effect was always the same. The binder showed less than the receipt. The donor's copy of the receipt was the accurate record. The drive's own record was not. Robert looked at the completed comparisons across all 3 sites. He said 122 items across 5 weeks. Nadine said across 3 sites and 11 Pruitt staffed days. Robert said, "What did he do with them?" Nadine said, "I do not know. I do not need to know to file the documentation. I need to know what the records show." Robert said, "What do they show?" She said they show that 122 items were received by donors and recorded on donor receipts, and were not recorded in the drive's intake binders on days that this specific volunteer staffed the intake station. That is what the records show. The rest is for the police. Robert nodded. He said, "You built the system with 2 records so that one could check the other." Nadine said, "I built it so that counting errors could be caught." This is not a counting error. But the system that caught counting errors also caught this. Robert said yes. That is what a good system does. It catches what you designed it to catch, and also what you did not know you needed to catch. Nadine said yes. That is what a good system does. Nadine compiled the documentation on Saturday morning. She had been awake since 5:30, which was not unusual for her in the active weeks of the drive. Robert had been up at 5:45 and had made the coffee and had set it on the table beside her materials without asking whether she wanted it, because they had been married for 38 years, and he knew when to bring coffee and when to wait, and the current moment was clearly a coffee moment. She was at the kitchen table at 6:30 with the coffee and the organized materials, the volunteer schedules for all 3 sites for the relevant weeks, the intake binders with the relevant pages marked with adhesive flags she had put in the previous evening, the receipt books with the relevant pages similarly marked, and the side-by-side comparison sheets she had prepared with Robert the night before, one for each site showing the discrepancies entry by entry, with the Pruitt staffed days highlighted in yellow. She had learned early in her administrative career that documentation served 2 purposes. It recorded what had happened, and it communicated what had happened to the person who needed to act on it. The second purpose required that the documentation be organized for the reader, not for the writer. She had seen too many administrative reports that were organized for the writer by chronology of discovery, rather than by logical structure by the author's confidence level, rather than by the audience's informational needs. She wrote this summary as if the reader had no prior knowledge of the food drive, no familiarity with the intake process, and no context for why item counts mattered. Victor Osei would read it and bring the perspective of a litigation attorney. Helen Garrett would read it and bring the perspective of a 21-year food bank director. Both would need the same thing, a clear account that could be acted on without reconstruction. The summary was 6 pages. The first page was a description of the intake process and the 2-record system. The second page was a description of the site, 7 finding dates, volunteer assignments, binder counts, receipt counts, discrepancies, and the total. The third and fourth pages covered sites 12 and 3 in the same format. The fifth page was a combined summary, 3 sites, 11 Pruitt-staffed days, 122 items. The sixth page was a description of what the pattern showed and 4 recommendations. She sent the summary at 8:15 in the morning to Helen Garrett and to Victor Osei. Helen Garrett had been the food bank director for 21 years, which meant she had been doing this work for 4 years when Nadine had made her calls in the aftermath of the plant closure. She had seen Nadine build the food drive from a reactive emergency operation to a structured annual campaign. She had watched Nadine design the 2-record intake system and had listened to Nadine explain why both records were necessary and had agreed. She read the summary on Saturday morning and called Nadine at 9:15. She said, "You built the system with the 2 records, and the 2 records caught it." Nadine said the system was designed to catch counting errors. It caught something else. Helen said, "But it caught it." Nadine said yes. Helen said 122 items. Nadine said across 5 weeks. Helen was quiet for a moment. She said, "Victor is going to call you." Nadine said, "I know." Helen said, "You already have what you need for the police." Nadine said yes. Victor said he will coordinate that. Helen said, "I am going to write a note to the donors. All the ones who can be identified. I want them to know what happened and what we did about it, and that the food they brought got to where it needed to go, even if the record was wrong." Nadine said the food did get there. The items may have been taken, but the distribution totals came from the pantry stock counts, not just the intake counts, so the pantries received what they received regardless. Helen said, "I want the donors to know that." Nadine said yes, they should know. Victor Osei read the documentation on Sunday morning and called Nadine on Sunday afternoon. Victor had been a civil litigation attorney for 38 years before retirement, and he had read thousands of documents in those 38 years and had developed the specific reading practice of someone whose work depended on understanding not just what a document said, but what it was designed to say, what it could prove, and what it left open. He was the kind of committee chair who read documents with the full attention of someone who understood what a document was for, and what it could do, and what it could not do. He had been on the Oversight Committee for 8 years because Helen Garrett had asked him to serve, and because the cause was real, and because he had time after retirement, and because he was the kind of person who, when asked to apply his skills to something that mattered, said yes. He had been on the Oversight Committee for 8 years. He said, "This is a complete record. You have the schedules, the intake logs, the receipts, and the comparison in a format that a third party can follow without any additional context. The pattern is unambiguous. It is also specific. You have not overreached. You have documented what the records show and left the inference explicit. That is correct." Nadine said the records show that 122 items were received by donors and confirmed on their receipts, and were not recorded in the drive's binders on days this volunteer staffed the intake station. The records do not tell me what happened to the items. They tell me what the discrepancy was. Victor said yes. What do you want to happen? Nadine said 4 things. First, the documentation forwarded to the police. Second, Aaron Pruitt's volunteer assignment terminated immediately. Third, a review of the intake process to close the gap that allowed this to go undetected for 5 weeks. Fourth, notification to the donors we can identify from the receipt book that a discrepancy was found and addressed. Victor said those are the right 4 things in the right order. I will have the committee authorize all 4 by Monday morning. The police were contacted Monday morning by Victor Osei, who submitted the documentation package, the 6-page summary, the binder pages, the receipt book pages, and the comparison sheets to the county police department's non-emergency intake. A detective contacted Victor on Tuesday. The investigation was opened. Nadine was not involved in the investigation after that point. She had provided what she had, and the matter was in the appropriate hands, and she had the drive to run. Aaron Pruitt's volunteer assignment was terminated on Monday by Bradley Holt, who sent a letter by email and by certified mail to the address on the volunteer application. Nadine did not send the letter and did not participate in the termination. That was Bradley's responsibility. She noted it as complete when he reported it to her. The intake process review took 3 days. Nadine conducted it herself, going through the existing procedure and identifying the gap. The gap was specific. The end-of-day reconciliation had relied on a sum that the intake volunteer could control on both sides, the binder sum and the receipt book sum, which meant that a volunteer who controlled both sums could make them match even when the individual entries did not. The fix was structural. It required that the binder and the receipt book be maintained by different hands at all times, and that the end-of-day reconciliation be done by the site coordinator rather than by the intake volunteer. The new procedure also added a spot check step. The site coordinator would select 5 entries at random during the day and compare the binder entry to the receipt carbon on the spot. A discrepancy on a spot check would trigger a full comparison. The new procedure was distributed to all 15 site coordinators by Thursday morning with an explanation of what had been found and why the change was being made. Nadine wrote the explanation in the same plain language format she used for all operational communication. Here is what happened. Here is what it shows about the procedure. Here is what is different now. She did not use the volunteer's name. She described the structural gap and the structural fix. The coordinators were experienced people, and they deserved a complete account. The donors whose items were undercounted were identified from the receipt book. 27 donors had signed their name on their receipt and could be contacted. The other recipients of the discrepancy could not be identified because they had not signed. Helen Garrett wrote the letter to the 27 identified donors, signed by herself and Nadine, which described what had happened in direct language. A discrepancy was found in the intake records at 3 sites. The discrepancy was linked to a specific volunteer's days. The volunteer's assignment has been terminated and the matter referred to law enforcement, and the food drive is grateful for your continued support and wanted you to know what happened and what we did about it. The letter also explained that the items received, all items including the discrepant ones, had been distributed to the food pantries and the community kitchen as intended, because the distribution was tracked from the pantry inventory and not exclusively from the intake count. One of those donors was a woman named Sylvia Tran, who had been donating to the food drive for 9 years and who called Nadine on Wednesday after receiving the letter. She was 63 years old and had moved to Millbrook from San Jose 14 years ago and had found the food drive in her 2nd year in town and had been giving every October since. She said, "I appreciate knowing. I want to know how you found it. Most organizations would have just corrected the count and not told anyone. Nadine said we found it because the receipt book and the intake binder are 2 separate records that should match. I compared them and they did not match. The receipt is the donor's record. The binder is the drive's record. When they do not match, the difference is where you look." Sylvia said, "I never thought about the receipt I take home being something that could be compared back to a record here." Nadine said most people do not think about it that way. The receipt is designed to protect the donor's record in case the organization's record is wrong. In this case, the organization's record was wrong. The receipt is what told us. Sylvia said that is a good system. Nadine said it is better now than it was. Sylvia said, "I will keep bringing my receipt home." Nadine said, "Yes, please do." The gap was now closed. The new procedure required 2 volunteers at the intake station at all times, the receipt book held by a separate volunteer from the binder with the site coordinator doing the reconciliation and the spot check. The pattern that had been visible in the individual entries for 5 weeks to anyone who had been required to compare the receipts to the binder entry by entry was now visible to the intake process itself, because the intake process now required that the comparison be done by someone who had not done the logging, which was the structural change that made the system self-checking in a way it had not been before. Robert said to Nadine on the evening after the committee meeting, "You found it because you compared the receipts." Nadine said, "I found it because I asked whether the receipts matched the binder, and then because I asked whether the discrepancy followed him across sites." Those are 2 different questions, but they are the same underlying question: is the record accurate? And if not, where is the inaccuracy coming from? Robert said, "You asked the same question twice with different targets." Nadine said, "Yes. The first target was the data. The second target was the source of the error in the data." He said, "How long have you been asking that question?" She said, 17 years. Every year, every site, every report. I read the reports every Monday morning, and the question underneath every number is, does this number match what I would expect to see? And if not, where do I look next? The record tells you what happened. The record that does not match something else tells you what happened that was not supposed to happen. He said, "You taught Kezia that." She said, "I did not teach Kezia the question. I taught Kezia to read the record against itself, to compare the organization's record to its own prior records, to compare what is claimed to what can be verified." She took that and made it into research. He said she is writing a dissertation about institutional data gaps. Nadine said, "I know." She calls me about it on Sundays and tells me what she is finding, and I tell her what I have seen in 17 years of comparing binders to receipt books, and she says, "Yes, that is what the literature shows." And I say, "Good." The literature caught up. He said, "You gave her the question." She considered this. She said the question was already in the work when I started doing the work. I learned it from Helen Garrett in year 2, when Helen said the count in November should match the distribution in December. When it does not, you have a question. I learned it from the plant closure families in year 1 who trusted that the food that was collected would get to them, and whose trust required that the record be accurate. I did not invent the question. I just never stopped asking it. She had been asking it for 17 years. She had built a career in parish administration on the same underlying practice. The same question applied to a different set of records in a different institutional context. The liturgical calendar should match the facility's schedule. The volunteer hours logged should match the work completed. The funds authorized should match the funds disbursed. In 14 years at St. Andrews, she had found 3 discrepancies that required attention. All of them honest errors. None of them consequential. All of them caught early because she compared the records as a matter of practice. The practice of comparison was not distrust of the people who made the records. It was stewardship of the institution that relied on the records being accurate. It was what you owed the people who trusted the institution. She had been asking the question in a parking lot at the community center in October of this year, looking at a discrepancy in a binder that should have matched a receipt book and did not. The question had produced a specific sequence of answers, each leading to the next. The receipt comparison at Site 7. The volunteer schedule review. The cross-site pattern recognition. The call to Bradley Holt. The request for the other site's records. The 8:45 Saturday morning delivery. The 2 hours at the kitchen table with Robert. The 6-page summary. The Sunday afternoon call with Victor Osei. The 4 authorized actions on Monday morning. The termination and the police referral and the new procedure and the 27 donor letters. Each step had followed from the question and from the answer, the question produced, and from the next question, the answer required. It had been methodical because the work was always methodical. It was how the work was done, how it had always been done, how it would continue to be done. The question had produced the specific answers that had produced the 6-page summary, that had produced the 4 actions the committee authorized on Monday morning, and the new procedure that 15 site coordinators were now implementing, and that Kezia was going to cite in Chapter 3 of a dissertation about institutional data gaps in nonprofit service delivery. Margaret Alves, the Site 12 coordinator, called Nadine on the Monday after the committee meeting. Margaret had been running Site 12 for 6 years and had the quality of someone who took her role seriously enough to be genuinely troubled when she had missed something. She said, "I want to understand why my site-level reconciliation did not catch this." I compared the totals. The totals matched. Nadine explained what she had found and what it meant about the way the end-of-day calculation had been managed. She said he was calculating both totals. The totals matched because he controlled the input on both sides. The entry-level comparison would have caught it, but the entry-level comparison was not required by the procedure. Margaret said I should have required it myself. Nadine said the procedure did not require it. You were following the procedure. Margaret said the procedure should have required it. Nadine said yes. That is why the procedure has changed. Margaret said, I want to know the new procedure in detail before the next collection day. Nadine said, I will send it to you today. James Whitfield at Site 3 called the same day. He asked 3 specific questions about the new procedure and took notes on the answers. He said, I want to understand the spot check step. Nadine walked him through it. He said, I will do this. She said, I know you will. Kezia called on Sunday evening, 2 days after the committee meeting. She called every Sunday evening, which was the standing call, and Nadine had decided before the call that she would tell her the whole story, because the story was directly related to Kezia's research, and because Kezia deserved the full account. She told her from the beginning, the Site 7 report, the Thursday visit, the receipt comparison, the individual entry analysis, the 3-site pattern, the Saturday documentation, the Monday actions. Kezia listened to the whole thing without interrupting. At the end, she said you compared the receipts to the binder. Nadine said yes. Kezia said what made you think to compare them at the entry level rather than just the daily total. Nadine said because the daily total could be manipulated by someone who controlled both sides of the calculation. I needed to see whether the individual entries matched before I could trust the totals. Kezia was quiet for a moment. She said, that is in Chapter 3 of my dissertation. The structural gap that allows a single actor to control both records simultaneously. The solution is structural separation of the records, 2 different people maintaining 2 different records that must match. Nadine said yes. That is the new procedure. Kezia said Mom. Nadine said yes. Kezia said you solved a research problem in a parking lot on a Thursday afternoon. Nadine said I solved a food drive problem. You can write about what it demonstrates. Kezia said I am going to cite this. Nadine said you can call it the Millbrook food drive case. Kezia said I am going to call it what it is. Nadine said what is it? Kezia said a demonstration that receipt-level comparison exposes discrepancies that daily total reconciliation cannot detect. Nadine said yes, that is what it is. That is. Patricia Dumas called Nadine on the Thursday after the committee meeting. Patricia was not an emotional person in the professional sense. 35 years of nursing had calibrated her responses to urgency and to recovery, and to the slow work of returning things to their correct state, and she brought those calibrations to the volunteer work the way she brought them to everything. But she had something to say that she had been organizing since Thursday. She said, "I have been thinking about the end-of-day reconciliation. I was doing it wrong for 5 weeks. I was comparing the totals he gave me instead of the entries." Nadine said the procedure did not require entry-level comparison. The procedure required end-of-day totals. You were following the procedure. Patricia said the procedure was inadequate. Nadine said yes. It was. That is why we changed it. Patricia said I should have noticed the count was low sooner. I noticed it in week 2 and I called you. That is the correct timeline given the procedure that existed. Nadine said yes. That is exactly the correct timeline. You called when the pattern appeared in the weekly count. The entry-level pattern was not visible in the weekly count given how he was managing the numbers. You could not have seen it without doing what I did on Thursday, which was to compare the records entry by entry. Patricia said I need to know that. Nadine said you did what the procedure required you to do. The procedure was not designed to catch what he was doing. The new procedure is. That is not a failure on your part. That is a gap in the system that has been closed. Patricia said I have been doing this for 4 years, and I have never had a problem at this site. Nadine said I know. That is part of the record too. Your site has run correctly for 4 years. Patricia said it will run correctly for the next 4. Nadine said yes. I know it will. The community kitchen at First Methodist served dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She went on the following Tuesday evening with a container of the pound cake she made in November when she had time, which she did not usually have in November. But this November was different because the intake process was solid, and the records were matching and the drive was in its 5th week and running well. The volunteer corps had been briefed on the new procedure and had implemented it without resistance. They were experienced people who understood that procedures changed when situations required it and who were not bothered by change when the reason for it was explained clearly. She brought the pound cake and set it on the dessert table and helped serve for 2 hours. The community kitchen had 37 regulars and an additional turnout each Tuesday and Thursday of between 20 and 40 people, depending on the weather and the season and the particular circumstances of the week. She knew most of the regulars by name, not because she had made a project of learning them, but because she had been coming here for 11 years, and the names had accumulated over time the way names accumulate when you are paying the right kind of attention over a long enough period. A man named Gerald came through the line for the 3rd time. He was 78 years old and had been coming to the community kitchen for 4 years, and he knew Nadine by name and she knew him. He had been a retired railroad worker for 12 years before he started coming here, which meant he had worked for 43 years on railroad maintenance in 3 states and had retired with something and had spent those 12 years spending it carefully, and then it had run out, in the way things run out when the math is done correctly, but the timeline is longer than the math expected. He had told her this on his 3rd visit 4 years ago when she had asked how he was doing, because she had asked in the specific way that was an invitation to the actual answer rather than the expected answer. He said, "Good pound cake tonight." She said, "I made it." He said, "I know you did. You bring it when things are going well." She said, "Things are going well." He said, "The drive." Nadine said yes. Gerald said, "Good." He took his plate and went to his table with the specific, unhurried quality of a man who knew where he was going and that the table would be there. She served for another hour. The food was enough. It had been enough every Tuesday and Thursday that she had been coming here, which was not because the supply was always plentiful, but because she had been paying attention to the supply and asking the question, is the record accurate in a way that kept the count accurate and kept the distribution matching the need? The families in November 20 years ago had needed the count to be right, and it had been right because the people organizing the count had been rigorous about the record. The people sitting in the community kitchen on a November Tuesday needed the same thing, someone who took the record seriously enough to compare it to itself. She served for another half hour and helped stack the chairs and wipe down the serving tables with a woman named Teresa who had been volunteering here for 9 years. And they talked for a few minutes about the drive and about Patricia Dumas and about the new procedure. And Teresa said, "So the 2 records have to match entry by entry." Nadine said yes. Entry by entry, not just the total. Teresa said that makes sense. Nadine said it makes more sense now than it did 2 months ago. Teresa laughed. She drove home in the November dark, which arrived early in November, and which she had been driving home in for 17 years of these Tuesday evenings. Robert was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the book he had been reading for 2 weeks. A history of early American postal routes that he had found at the estate sale, where he had also found the Windsor chair he was restoring. He was a person who could read in the kitchen while knowing when Nadine had come in. He looked up when she sat down across from him. He said, "How was it?" She said, "Good." Gerald had the pound cake 3 times. He said he is going to be there next year. Robert said yes. He said the drive closes this week. Nadine said the records are matching. The count is right. Robert set down his book. He said you built the receipt-level comparison into the system from the beginning. Nadine said I built it for counting errors. It caught something else. He said yes, but it caught it because you had built it. She said yes. He said, "You know what Kezia is going to say about that?" Nadine said she is going to say, "I demonstrated that a system designed for the most probable failure mode can also catch less probable failure modes if the structural separation is sufficient." Robert said, "Is that right?" Nadine said yes. Robert said that is a good system. She said it is better now than it was. He picked up his book. He said, "Good night, Nadine." She said good night. She had been asking the same question for 17 years. The question was, does the record match what actually happened? When it did not, she asked the next question, where is the gap and how do we close it? She had been asking this in large institutional contexts and in small operational ones, and in a community center parking lot on a Thursday afternoon in October, and the answer had always been, the gap is specific, and the specific gap has a specific close, and the close makes the record more accurate, and the more accurate record protects the people who trust it. She had closed 122 items worth of gap in October. The next year, the intake process would catch what this year's process had not caught for 5 weeks. Patricia Dumas would run Site 7 with 2 volunteers at the intake station and the site coordinator doing the reconciliation. Sylvia Tran would keep her receipt and bring it home. Gerald would have the pound cake when it was available. The record would be accurate. The food would be where it was supposed to be. That was the work. She had been doing it for 17 years, and she planned to do it for as long as it was necessary. She had said that to Helen Garrett in the first year, and Helen had said, "I hope that is a very long time." Nadine had said, "I hope the same." They had both understood what they meant, that the need for food in November was not a temporary condition, but a structural one, and structural conditions required structured, ongoing responses, not one-time efforts. They had both been right about the timeline. It was still necessary. She would be back on Thursday. The records would be accurate. The food would be where it needed to be. The intake volunteers at all 15 sites would be working in pairs with the receipt book and the binder in separate hands, and the site coordinators would be doing the entry-level reconciliation and the spot checks. And if any entry did not match, the site coordinator would know within the day and would call Nadine, and Nadine would act. She had built the system with 2 records, and now the system required 2 people and 2 views of the same event and an independent reconciler who had not done the logging. The system was better than it had been. It would catch what the prior system had not caught. It would protect the people who trusted the food to be there who trusted that the can of soup they had dropped off at the community center on a Tuesday morning was the can of soup that ended up on someone's table on a Thursday evening at the community kitchen or on the shelf at the food pantry that a family would visit on Saturday. The record was the thing that connected those two events. The record had to be accurate. She had been making certain it was accurate for 17 years, and she planned to continue. She thought about the plant closure families sometimes not as a specific memory, but as the thing that had started all of it. 400 families, 11 days, 3,000 pounds. She had made calls to everyone she knew, and the calls had worked, and the food had been there. What she had not known at the time was that the food being there was the visible part. The invisible part was the record. The record was what made certain that the food counted as collected was the food that reached the families that the items donated were the items distributed, that the count in the receipt book matched, the count in the binder matched the count at the pantry. The families trusted that the food they received was the food that had been given for them. The record was the thing that protected the trust. She had spent 17 years protecting the trust. She had done it in October of this year in a parking lot at the community center, sitting in her car with her phone and organizing what she knew before the call. The full picture had taken 5 days from the Thursday visit to the Saturday summary. The 5 days had produced 122 items accounted for 4 actions authorized, a new procedure implemented, and 27 donors notified. The drive had continued. The records were accurate. The food was where it needed to be. Gerald would have the pound cake again next November. He had told her on his way to the table that he intended to be there. She intended to bring the cake. The drive would run its 6 weeks, and the records would match, and the count would be right. That was not a promise. It was the result of 17 years of asking the same question: is the record accurate? And if not, where is the gap, and how do we close it?